Tonight, we will walk together through the cobblestone streets of a medieval market town, where the morning mist still clings to thatched roofs, and the first merchants are already arranging their wares beneath wooden awnings. You'll discover stories of distant spice islands, mysterious trade routes, and the quiet rhythm of a world where commerce meant community, and every transaction carried with it the weight of tradition and trust. But as we journey deeper into these bustling squares, narrow alleyways, we'll uncover something unexpected about the true source of a medieval merchant's greatest treasure. Something that had nothing to do with coins or exotic goods, and everything to do with a secret that would only reveal itself centuries later. As the first light of dawn touches the weathered stone walls of Canterbury, the bells of the great cathedral ring out across the sleeping town, their bronze voices echoing through narrow streets lined with half-timbered houses. The year is 1347, and the world feels both vast and intimate, connected by ancient roads and waterways that carry not just goods, but dreams, stories, and the irrepressible human desire for what lies beyond the horizon. This is the golden age of the medieval market, when entire economies revolved around the simple act of gathering in open squares to exchange the fruits of human labor and ingenuity. The air carries a blend of aromas that would be foreign to our modern senses: wood smoke from countless hearths, the earthy scent of freshly turned soil from surrounding farms, and underneath it all, the tantalizing whisper of something exotic: cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from Malabar, and cloves from islands so distant that most people believed them to be mythical. These spices had traveled thousands of miles, passed through dozens of hands, survived storms at sea and bandits on land, all to reach this modest English market town where a prosperous wool merchant might trade a season's profits for a single pound of precious saffron. But the medieval marketplace was far more than a center of commerce. It was the beating heart of community life, where news traveled faster than any messenger, where marriages were arranged and disputes settled, where the rhythm of the agricultural year played out in the seasonal bounty displayed on wooden trestle tables. The market cross stood at the center of it all, its carved stone surface worn smooth by countless hands seeking blessing upon their transactions, a silent witness to the thousands of small dramas that unfolded daily in its shadow. In the pre-dawn darkness, before the cathedral bells had sounded, the market square lay empty save for the occasional cat picking its way delicately across the cobblestones. But even in this quiet hour, the day's commerce was already beginning miles away, as ox-drawn carts laden with goods creaked slowly along muddy roads toward the town. Peasant farmers walked alongside their livestock, driving geese and sheep through the morning mist, their breath visible in the crisp air as they murmured gentle encouragements to their animals. These people had risen before cockcrow, loading their carts with eggs nestled in straw, wheels of cheese wrapped in linen, and baskets of vegetables still damp with dew from their gardens. The relationship between town and countryside was one of mutual dependence that shaped every aspect of medieval life. The farmers needed the services and goods that only the town could provide: iron tools forged by the blacksmith, cloth woven by the guild masters, ale brewed in the monastery's brewhouse. The townspeople, in turn, depended utterly on the countryside for their daily bread, quite literally, as well as for the raw materials that fed their crafts and trades. This interdependence created a web of relationships that bound communities together across the social hierarchy, from the poorest serf to the richest merchant. As the eastern sky began to blush with the first hint of sunrise, the market square gradually came to life. The night watchman made his final rounds, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls as he checked that all was secure. Soon, the first vendors would arrive to claim their traditional spots. For in the medieval world, custom and precedent ruled supreme, and a family might hold the rights to a particular market stall for generations. The butchers would set up near the market cross, where they could be closely supervised by the town officials, their stalls equipped with thick wooden blocks scarred by years of use, and channels carved in the stone to carry away the blood from their work. The spice merchants, those princes of medieval commerce, would arrange their precious wares with the care of jewelers displaying gemstones. Their small wooden chests and leather pouches contained treasures that had journeyed farther than most people would travel in their entire lifetimes. A handful of black peppercorns had begun its journey in the western Ghats of India, where monsoon rains nourished the climbing vines. From there, it had traveled by ship across the Arabian Sea to ports like Calicut, where Arab merchants had negotiated for months to secure the best prices. These same peppercorns had then been loaded onto dhows that sailed north through the Red Sea, surviving pirates and storms, before being transferred to caravans that crossed the desert to Alexandria. But centuries earlier, in a monastery nestled in the rolling hills of Burgundy, a different kind of commerce was taking place. Brother Benedict, the monastery's cellarer, was carefully inspecting the day's catch from the fish ponds. The Cistercian order had long prided itself on self-sufficiency, but even they could not produce everything they needed. Salt, essential for preserving meat through the long winter months, had to be purchased from merchants who brought it from distant coastal salt pans. The irony was not lost on Brother Benedict that their quest for spiritual purity required them to engage with the worldly commerce they sought to transcend. The monastery's involvement in trade was a delicate balance. Their lay brothers were permitted to travel to nearby markets, but never alone, and never for more than a few days' journey. The rule was clear. Too much exposure to worldly concerns could corrupt the soul. Yet the monastery's very survival depended on selling their surplus, the fine woolen cloth woven in their workshops, the cheese aged in their cool cellars, the manuscripts copied in their scriptoriums. These goods found eager buyers in the town markets, where the monastery's reputation for quality commanded premium prices. Unbeknownst to them, Brother Benedict and his fellow monks were part of a commercial revolution that was reshaping medieval Europe. The growth of towns and the expansion of trade were creating new social classes and new forms of wealth that would eventually challenge the traditional feudal order. But for now, in this quiet monastery, such changes seemed as distant as the Spice Islands themselves. Meanwhile, in another corner of the world, a young Venetian merchant named Marco was learning the family trade in the bustling Rialto market. Venice in 1275 was the crossroads of the medieval world, where European silver met Asian spices, where Byzantine silk mingled with Flemish wool. The city's unique position had made it fabulously wealthy, but that wealth came at a price. Venetian merchants regularly risked their lives sailing to distant ports, their galleys armed against pirates and loaded with goods worth king's ransoms. Marco watched as his father negotiated with a spice merchant from Alexandria, the two men speaking in the mixture of languages that served as the lingua franca of medieval trade. The merchant's samples were laid out on silk cloth, tiny mounds of cinnamon bark curled like ancient scrolls, star anise shaped like tiny flowers, nutmeg seeds smooth as polished wood. Each spice told a story of its origin. The cinnamon had been stripped from trees in Ceylon by workers who guarded the secret of its harvest as closely as any state secret. The nutmeg came from islands so remote that European map makers still marked them with drawings of sea monsters and warnings of uncharted dangers. The negotiation was a delicate dance of mutual respect and barely concealed suspicion. Both men knew that fortunes could be made or lost on a single cargo, that a shipwreck or a change in political winds could transform a profitable venture into financial ruin. Yet they also knew that without such risks, there could be no rewards. The spice trade was not just about commerce. It was about courage, cunning, and the willingness to venture into the unknown. Decades later, back in our English market town, the morning sun had fully risen, and the square was alive with activity. Merchants called out their wares in voices trained to carry over the crowd, while customers moved from stall to stall, examining goods with the practiced eye of people for whom every purchase was a careful calculation. The town's prosperity was evident in the quality of the goods on display and the fine clothing of the wealthier merchants. But it was also fragile, dependent on weather, politics, and the thousand small disasters that could disrupt trade. A prosperous wool merchant named Thomas was conducting his morning business with the easy confidence of a man who had learned his trade through decades of experience. His stall displayed bolts of fine cloth in colors that spoke of far distant dyes, deep blues from woad grown in Picardy, rich reds from madder root cultivated in the Low Countries, and most precious of all, lengths of silk dyed with kermes, a color so vibrant it seemed to glow in the morning light. Thomas had learned the cloth trade as an apprentice, spending 7 years learning not just the technical aspects of his craft, but the complex web of relationships that made commerce possible. The guild system that governed his trade was both a protection and a constraint. As a master clothier, Thomas enjoyed privileges that were jealously guarded: the right to train apprentices, to sell his goods in the market, to participate in guild governance. But these privileges came with strict obligations. He could not undercut his fellow guild members' prices, could not work on holy days, could not use inferior materials or techniques that might damage the guild's reputation. The guild was more than a trade association. It was a brotherhood that provided for its members' widows and orphans, maintained a chapel in the parish church, and settled disputes among its members with a combination of practical wisdom and ancient custom. But Thomas had learned something in his travels that troubled him, something that made him question the rigid certainties of guild life. In Flanders, he had seen weavers working with new techniques that produced cloth of unprecedented quality and beauty. These innovations were carefully guarded secrets, passed down through families and protected by oaths of secrecy. Yet Thomas knew that such innovations were the key to prosperity in an increasingly competitive world. The question that haunted him was whether tradition and innovation could coexist, or whether progress inevitably meant the destruction of the old ways. As the morning progressed, the character of the market began to change. The early buyers, household servants purchasing provisions for the day's meals, craftsmen seeking raw materials for their work, gave way to a different class of customer. These were the merchants and factors who would transport goods to other markets, the representatives of distant guilds seeking particular commodities, the occasional traveler from foreign lands whose strange dress and unfamiliar language added an air of exotic mystery to the proceedings. Among these more exotic visitors was a man who called himself simply Ahmed, though his rich robes and the deference shown him by other merchants suggested a status far above his modest manner. Ahmed was a spice merchant from Damascus, one of the few who dealt directly with the ultimate sources of the precious goods he sold. He spoke little of his origins or his methods, but the quality of his wares spoke for itself. His pepper was whole and black, free of the dust and debris that marked inferior grades. His cinnamon was thick and oily, its scent so intense that customers could smell his stall from across the square. Most precious of all were the tiny threads of saffron, each one hand-picked from crocus flowers in the mountains of Kashmir, worth more than their weight in silver. Ahmed's presence in this modest English town was testament to the reach of medieval commerce, but it also hinted at darker realities. The spice trade was built on a foundation of secrecy and deliberate mystification. Arab merchants like Ahmed had for centuries guarded the true sources of their goods, spinning elaborate tales of the dangers they faced and the difficulties they overcame in order to justify their enormous markups. They spoke of cinnamon birds that nested in cliffs so high no man could reach them, of pepper groves guarded by fierce tribes, of spice islands shrouded in perpetual mist, where navigation was possible only by magic. These stories were not entirely false, but they were carefully crafted to maintain the merchant's monopoly on information. The reality was that spice production was often controlled by well-organized kingdoms and trading companies who maintained their own fleets and trading posts across the Indian Ocean. The Chola kingdom of southern India had built a vast commercial empire based on pepper and other spices, their ships sailing as far as China and the Persian Gulf. The island kingdom of Sri Lanka had grown wealthy from its cinnamon forests, carefully managing their harvest to maintain both quality and scarcity. But European knowledge of these distant lands remained frustratingly vague. Maps showed the Indian Ocean, dotted with islands labeled with names like Isle of Spices or Fortunate Islands, but their exact locations remained mysterious. This ignorance would persist for centuries until Portuguese navigators finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and broke the Arab monopoly on the spice trade. But that revolution lay far in the future, and for now, merchants like Ahmed held the keys to one of the world's most profitable trades. The monastery bells were ringing the hour of terce when a commotion near the cloth merchant's stalls drew Thomas's attention. A group of young apprentices had gathered around a stranger, their eyes wide with fascination. The man was clearly from the eastern lands. His skin was weathered by desert sun. His robes were of a cut and color unknown in England, and when he spoke, it was in accented Latin, mixed with phrases in a tongue none of them recognized. He was showing them samples of silk, so fine it seemed to shimmer with its own light. Threads so thin they were barely visible, yet strong enough to support the weight of a man. This was silk from the legendary land of Serica, a substance so precious that Roman emperors had once paid its weight in gold for it. The stranger spoke of caravans that traveled for months across deserts, where the sun could kill a man in hours, and the cold night air could freeze water solid. He told of cities built around oases, their walls decorated with tiles that caught and reflected light, like captured stars, where merchants from a dozen nations gathered to trade goods that had traveled halfway around the world. The apprentices listened with rapt attention, but their masters were more skeptical. They had heard such tales before, and while they didn't doubt the quality of the goods, they knew that every merchant was also a storyteller, and that the line between truth and salesmanship was often deliberately blurred. Still, there was something about this particular stranger that gave his words credibility. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence in his manner, or the way he handled the precious silk as if it were merely one of many wonders he had seen. Some historians believe that such encounters were more common than medieval records suggest, and that the exchange of goods was accompanied by an equally important exchange of ideas and knowledge. The merchant from Serica might carry with him not just silk, but news of distant wars, stories of different ways of living, and techniques of production that could revolutionize European crafts. A recipe for making paper, a method of preserving food, a technique for dyeing cloth. Such knowledge could be worth far more than any material goods. Yet, the medieval world was also remarkably conservative, slow to adopt new ways even when their benefits were obvious. The guild system that brought order and prosperity to medieval trades also created resistance to change. Innovations that threatened established methods or challenged existing hierarchies were often viewed with suspicion, and those who advocated for them might find themselves accused of heresy or treason. Progress, when it came, often did so slowly and against fierce resistance. In the castle that overlooked the market town, Lady Eleanor was overseeing the preparation of the midday meal in the great kitchens. The castle's kitchens were a world unto themselves, a vast complex of rooms and chambers where dozens of servants labored to feed not just the lord's family, but the small army of retainers, servants, and guests who made the castle their home. The scale of the operation was staggering. On a feast day, the kitchens might prepare food for 500 people or more, requiring coordination and planning that would challenge a modern restaurant. The kitchens were built of thick stone walls, designed to contain the enormous fires that burned in hearths large enough for a man to stand upright within. These fires burned continuously, fed by cartloads of wood brought in from the castle's forests, their smoke rising through massive chimneys that had been engineered to draw properly and prevent the accumulation of deadly gases. The heat was intense, even in winter, and the kitchen staff worked in clothing adapted to their harsh environment. Leather aprons to protect against sparks, cloth caps to keep hair away from flames, and wooden clogs that could be quickly shed if they caught fire. Lady Eleanor moved through this organized chaos with the assured step of someone born to command. She had been trained from childhood in the arts of household management, and she understood that the smooth operation of the castle's domestic arrangements was essential to her husband's political and military effectiveness. A lord who could not properly feed his retainers would find it difficult to maintain their loyalty, and a castle whose kitchens failed during a siege might fall not to enemy weapons, but to hunger and disease. The ingredients for the day's feast came from sources scattered across the surrounding countryside and far beyond. The meat course would feature beef from the castle's own herds, supplemented by game brought back from the morning's hunt. Venison, wild boar, and various fowl whose preparation required specialized skills passed down through generations of kitchen servants. The fish course would include both freshwater fish from the castle's ponds and more exotic varieties brought by merchants from the coast, carefully packed in barrels of salt and ice to preserve their freshness during the journey inland. But it was the spice cupboard that represented the true measure of the castle's wealth and status. Here, locked away in an iron-bound chest to which only Lady Eleanor held the key, were the precious aromatics that could transform simple ingredients into the sophisticated dishes expected at a noble table. There were whole nutmegs from the distant Spice Islands, their surfaces rough and oily to the touch. There were sticks of cinnamon bark, curled and fragrant, that had grown on trees in Ceylon and been transported across thousands of miles of ocean and desert. Most precious of all were the tiny threads of saffron, each one worth more than a laborer's daily wage, that would color and flavor the special dishes prepared only for the most important guests. The use of these spices required not just wealth, but knowledge and skill. A cook who used too much of a precious spice might ruin a dish and waste a fortune in the process. Too little, and the subtle flavors that marked a truly sophisticated cuisine would be lost. The castle's head cook had spent years learning the proper proportions and combinations, knowledge that was as carefully guarded as any military secret, and passed down through apprenticeships that lasted for decades. Unbeknownst to them, the castle's elaborate culinary arrangements were part of a larger transformation taking place across medieval Europe. The growth of trade and the increasing availability of exotic ingredients were creating new forms of conspicuous consumption that marked social status and political power. A lord who could serve his guests dishes flavored with spices from the far reaches of the known world was demonstrating not just his wealth, but his connections to the great trading networks that spanned continents. But this transformation was not without its costs. The increasing sophistication of noble cuisine created pressure for ever more exotic and expensive ingredients, driving merchants to take greater risks and travel to more distant lands. The spice trade became not just a commercial enterprise, but a form of international diplomacy, where control of trade routes could determine the rise and fall of kingdoms. Meanwhile, outside the castle walls, the market day was reaching its peak intensity. The square was now crowded with people from every level of society, their voices creating a constant buzz of negotiation, greeting, and gossip. Peasant women sold eggs and vegetables from baskets balanced on their heads, their weathered faces speaking of lives spent in close contact with the earth and its seasons. Prosperous merchants in fur-trimmed robes examined goods with the practiced eye of professional traders, their apprentices trailing behind them with ledgers and sample bags. The guildmasters moved through the crowd with the dignity of men conscious of their important role in the town's prosperity. These were the bakers whose bread fed the population, the blacksmiths whose tools made agriculture possible, the carpenters whose skills built the houses and shops that sheltered the community. Each guild had its own traditions, its own patron saint, its own elaborate ceremonies that marked the progression from apprentice to journeyman to master. These rituals were not mere formality. They were the means by which technical knowledge was preserved and transmitted, ensuring that the skills essential to civilized life would not be lost. But the guild system was also beginning to show signs of strain. The increasing complexity of trade and the growing wealth of successful merchants were creating new social tensions. Master craftsmen who had grown rich through their guild connections were becoming indistinguishable from the merchant class, while ordinary journeymen found it increasingly difficult to advance to master status as the costs and requirements for advancement grew ever more demanding. These tensions would eventually contribute to the social upheavals that would mark the end of the medieval period. But for now, they remained largely beneath the surface of daily life. A bell was ringing from the direction of the abbey when a group of Cistercian lay brothers appeared at the edge of the market square, their simple brown robes marking them as men who had chosen a different path from the worldly concerns that surrounded them. Yet their presence here was not accidental or reluctant. They had come to conduct business that was essential to their monastery's survival and mission. Brother Francis, the group's leader, made his way to the cloth merchant's area, where he was a familiar and welcome figure. The abbey's workshops produced woolen cloth of exceptional quality, the result of careful breeding of their sheep and meticulous attention to every step of the production process. Their cloth commanded premium prices, not just for its quality, but for the reputation of the monks who made it. In an age when fraud and deception were common in commercial transactions, the abbey's commitment to honesty made their goods particularly valued. The transaction that followed was conducted with the quiet efficiency of men who knew each other well and had built a relationship based on mutual trust and respect. Brother Francis examined the merchant's samples with the eye of an expert, checking the fineness of the weave and the consistency of the dye. The merchant, in turn, inspected the abbey's cloth with equal care, knowing that his own reputation depended on the quality of the goods he sold to his customers. But their conversation ranged beyond immediate commercial concerns. Brother Francis brought news from other monasteries in the region, information about weather conditions and harvest prospects that could affect future prices. The merchant shared intelligence from his travels about political developments and changes in trade routes that might create new opportunities or challenges. This exchange of information was as valuable as any material goods, part of the vast informal network that kept medieval commerce functioning, despite the absence of modern communication systems. As the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the cobblestones, a new type of excitement began to ripple through the crowd. Word was spreading that a traveling merchant had arrived from the east with goods of unusual quality and rarity. This was not one of the regular traders who appeared at every market, but a stranger whose origins and methods remained mysterious. His pack animals were of a breed unfamiliar to English eyes, and his servants spoke among themselves in a language none of the locals could identify. The merchant himself was a man of middle years, with the weathered look of someone who had spent much of his life traveling in harsh climates. His clothing was rich but practical, made from fabrics that managed to be both beautiful and durable. When he spoke, it was in careful Latin with an accent that suggested origins far to the east of the known world. He introduced himself simply as Constantine, a name that could have been Roman, Greek, or adopted for the convenience of European customers. Constantine's goods were displayed with the care of a man who understood their true value. There were spices, of course. Pepper so black and aromatic that its scent could be detected from yards away. Cinnamon bark so thick and oily, it seemed to glow in the sunlight. Cloves so perfectly formed, they looked like tiny works of art. But there were also other things, goods that spoke of distant civilizations and unknown techniques of production. There were lengths of silk so fine, they seemed more like captured light than woven fabric, their colors shifting and changing as they moved in the breeze. There were small vials of precious oils and perfumes, whose scents spoke of gardens in lands where the very flowers were different from anything that grew in Europe. Most intriguing of all were several small objects that appeared to be made of a white substance harder than ivory and more translucent than horn. Porcelain, Constantine explained, made by craftsmen in the distant land of Cathay, using techniques that were among the most closely guarded secrets in the world. The crowd that gathered around Constantine's display represented a cross-section of the town's most prosperous citizens. Thomas the wool merchant was there, his practiced eye evaluating the quality of the silk. Lady Eleanor had sent her steward to examine the spices and report back on their potential for enhancing the castle's cuisine. Several guildmasters clustered around the porcelain objects, trying to understand how such delicate beauty could be created from clay. But Constantine was more than a mere merchant. He was also a storyteller, and the tales he told of his travels were as captivating as the goods he offered for sale. He spoke of cities built entirely of marble, where fountains played in courtyards larger than entire English villages. He described deserts where the sand was so fine it could polish metal to a mirror finish, and mountains so high their peaks were lost in clouds that never cleared. He told of ports where ships from 100 nations gathered, their holds filled with goods from every corner of the known world and many corners that remained unknown. Some historians believe that merchants like Constantine were among the most important sources of geographical and cultural knowledge in the medieval period, their stories providing Europeans with their first glimpses of the wider world. Yet their accounts were inevitably colored by commercial considerations and the natural human tendency to embellish a good story. The challenge for their listeners was to separate fact from fiction, useful information from mere entertainment. As the afternoon progressed, Constantine's presence began to have a subtle but noticeable effect on the entire market. Other merchants found themselves questioned more closely about the origins and quality of their goods. Customers who had been satisfied with local products began to express interest in more exotic alternatives. The very presence of such obviously superior goods raised questions about the adequacy of what had previously been considered perfectly acceptable. This was one of the ways in which trade served not just to exchange goods, but to transmit new standards and expectations. A merchant who had seen Constantine's silk might return home dissatisfied with the local weaver's best efforts. A cook who had tasted dishes prepared with Constantine's spices might find familiar flavors suddenly bland and uninteresting. Trade was thus not just an economic activity, but a cultural force, gradually raising expectations and creating demand for goods and services that had previously been unimaginable. But Constantine's impact extended beyond mere commerce. In his conversations with local scholars and clergy, he dropped hints about knowledge and learning that existed in the distant lands he had visited. He spoke casually of libraries containing thousands of books, of scholars who had preserved the learning of ancient Greece and Rome while Europe struggled through its dark centuries, of mathematical and astronomical techniques that made European methods seem primitive by comparison. These hints were tantalizing but frustratingly vague. Constantine was clearly a man of some education, but his primary interest was in trade, not scholarship. He deflected direct questions about the technical details of Eastern learning, claiming that such knowledge was closely guarded by the scholars who possessed it and could not be shared with outsiders. Yet his very existence proved that such knowledge existed, and that contact between East and West was not only possible but profitable. The shadows were growing long across the market square when a group of musicians appeared, their instruments and colorful clothing marking them as traveling entertainers. Such groups were a common sight at medieval markets, providing entertainment that helped draw customers and create the festive atmosphere that encouraged spending. But this particular group was different. Their instruments included several that were unfamiliar to English eyes, and their music incorporated melodies and rhythms that seemed to come from distant lands. The lead musician, a woman of perhaps 30 years with skin darkened by sun and wind, began to sing in a language none of the locals recognized. Her voice was clear and strong, trained by years of performing in the open air, and even without understanding her words, the crowd found themselves drawn into the emotional landscape of her song. It was a tale of love and loss, of journeys across vast distances, and the longing for home that touched the hearts of travelers everywhere. As she sang, the other musicians wove intricate harmonies around her voice, their unfamiliar instruments adding textures and colors that created an entirely new kind of musical experience for their English audience. There was a stringed instrument played with a bow that produced sounds sweeter and more complex than the simple fiddles familiar to local musicians. There was a drum whose deep, resonant tones seemed to echo from some vast cavern, and small metal cymbals that added sparkles of brightness like sunlight on water. Between songs, the musicians shared stories of their travels, describing the different musical traditions they had encountered in their wanderings. Music, they explained, was a universal language that transcended the barriers of speech and custom that separated peoples. In every land they had visited, from the mountain kingdoms of the far north to the desert cities of the south, they had found people who created beauty through sound, who used rhythm and melody to express emotions and experiences that words could not capture. But their music also carried deeper messages about the interconnectedness of the medieval world. The melodies they played showed clear influences from many different traditions: Arabic scales mixed with Northern European harmonies, African rhythms combined with Byzantine vocal techniques. Their music was living proof that the medieval world, despite its apparent isolation and parochialism, was actually a place of constant cultural exchange and mutual influence. As evening approached and the market began to wind down, Constantine prepared to pack away his precious goods. His day had been successful. Several of his most valuable items had found buyers among the town's wealthiest citizens, and he had established contacts that would serve him well on future visits. But more than that, he had served as a bridge between worlds, bringing a touch of the exotic East to this modest English town, and carrying back with him knowledge of European needs and preferences that would influence his future trading decisions. The transactions of the day represented more than simple commerce. They were part of a vast network of exchange that connected the furthest reaches of the medieval world. The pepper that Lady Eleanor would use to season her next feast had grown on vines tended by farmers in Malabar who had never heard of England. The silver coins that Constantine accepted in payment would eventually find their way to the markets of Damascus or Constantinople, where they would be melted down and recast into forms more familiar to Eastern merchants. Yet for all its international scope, medieval trade remained fundamentally personal. Success depended not on abstract market forces, but on individual relationships built up over years of careful cultivation. A merchant's reputation was his most valuable asset, more precious than any cargo he might carry. Trust, once lost, could never be fully recovered, and the most profitable trades were often those conducted between men who had known each other for decades. As the last customers departed and the vendors began packing their unsold goods, the market square gradually returned to the quiet that had marked its pre-dawn hours. The cobblestones were littered with the detritus of a day's commerce, scraps of straw from the packing materials, a few coins dropped and forgotten in the excitement of bargaining, the lingering sense of exotic spices and foreign foods. But the impact of the day's activities would linger long after the physical traces had been swept away. News of Constantine's arrival would spread to neighboring towns, carried by the merchants and travelers who formed the medieval world's informal communication network. Other traders would adjust their routes and their inventories based on the information they had gathered about changing tastes and new opportunities. In the castle's great kitchen, Lady Eleanor was already planning how to incorporate Constantine's spices into her Michaelmas feast, envisioning dishes that would astound her guests and enhance her husband's reputation for magnificence. In the monastery, Brother Francis was calculating how the day's sales would contribute to the abbey's building fund, while considering whether the order's workshops might benefit from adopting some of the techniques Constantine had described. And in workshops throughout the town, craftsmen were examining the samples they had purchased, trying to understand the methods used to create goods of such obvious quality. A few would succeed in adapting Eastern techniques to local conditions, creating innovations that would gradually spread throughout Europe. Most would fail, lacking either the skill or the resources needed to master unfamiliar methods. But their attempts were part of the slow process by which knowledge and technique moved across the medieval world. The medieval market was thus far more than a place of simple exchange. It was a node in a vast network of communication and cultural transmission that connected distant civilizations and gradually transformed them all. Each transaction carried with it not just goods, but ideas, techniques, and ways of seeing the world that would slowly but inevitably change the societies that participated in this great exchange. As the cathedral bells marked the evening hours and the last light faded from the western sky, the market town settled into the quiet rhythms of night. But in distant lands, other markets were just beginning their daily cycles. Other merchants were displaying their wares to crowds of eager buyers. Other stories of commerce and adventure were unfolding under different stars. The spice that had traveled from a remote island in the Moluccas to grace an English nobleman's table was merely one thread in a tapestry of exchange that spanned the known world and reached into lands that existed only in rumors and legends. The medieval market was both intensely local, rooted in the particular needs and customs of its community, and profoundly global, connecting the humblest village to the great currents of international trade and cultural exchange that were slowly but inexorably reshaping the world. And so, our journey through the medieval marketplace draws to a gentle close, though the echoes of that distant commerce continue to resonate through the centuries. The secret that Constantine and merchants like him carried was not hidden in any particular spice or exotic good, but in the simple truth that the world was far larger, more diverse, and more interconnected than most people of their time could imagine. Their greatest treasure was not the wealth they accumulated, but the knowledge they preserved and transmitted, the understanding that human beings, regardless of the differences in their languages, customs, and beliefs, shared common needs and desires that could be met through peaceful exchange and mutual respect. Perhaps, as you drift toward sleep, you can hear the distant sounds of that long-ago market, the calls of vendors hawking their wares, the gentle lowing of cattle, the creak of ox carts on cobblestone streets, and underneath it all, the quiet conversations of people from different worlds discovering that they were not so different after all. The medieval market reminds us that commerce, at its best, is not merely about profit, but about connection, the fundamental human desire to reach beyond our immediate circumstances and touch something larger than ourselves.